I saw my son working as a janitor in the building he used to own, and at that moment, I knew someone had stolen more than his company. My name is Robert Drummond. I'm 68 years old, a retired construction foreman from Charleston, South Carolina. I spent 43 years pouring foundations, framing houses, and teaching young men that integrity isn't negotiable. I thought I'd seen every kind of theft a man could commit: skimmed invoices, stolen tools, padded timesheets. I was wrong. Some thefts don't announce themselves. They happen in silence, in documents signed by broken hands, in empires transferred while good men grieve. If you're watching this, do me a favor. Drop your city and state in the comments below. I want to know who's out there, where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you've ever had to fight for family. And subscribe, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. It was 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night when I pulled into the parking lot of Meridian Commercial Solutions. The building stood 7 stories tall, all glass and steel, lit up like a crown against the Charleston sky. My son Scott built this place from nothing, started in a garage with a laptop and a dream, turned it into the largest commercial property management firm in the Low Country. I had his dinner in a bag on my passenger seat. Margaret, my late wife, used to pack his lunches when he worked construction with me summers during college. Old habits die hard. Scott had left it on my kitchen counter that afternoon, and I knew he'd be working late. He always worked late. The lobby doors were unlocked. The security desk was empty. Budget cuts, probably. My boots echoed on the polished marble as I walked toward the elevators. I expected to ride up to the 7th floor, see my boy in his corner office, maybe share a coffee while he ate. Then I saw him. 6th floor hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and there was Scott, my son, 42 years old, on his hands and knees in a gray janitor's uniform, scrubbing baseboards with a rag that had seen better days. I stopped breathing. This was his building, his company. His name used to be on the directory in the lobby. Scott Drummond, CEO and founder. Now he was invisible labor, cleaning the baseboards of his own empire at midnight where no one would see him. He didn't notice me yet. His head was down, shoulders hunched, moving the rag in slow mechanical circles. There was something in his posture I'd never seen before, a kind of defeat that made my chest tighten. I've seen men broken by job site accidents, by divorces, by markets that turned against them. But watching your own son disappear into the margins of what he created, that's a different kind of pain. Scott, I said quietly. He jerked upright, nearly knocking over his cleaning bucket. When he turned and saw me, his face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: shock, shame, and something close to relief. Dad, his voice cracked. What are you doing here? I held up the paper bag. You forgot your dinner. He stared at the bag like it was written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. Then his face crumpled. And my son, my grown son, who used to run a 100-employee company, started to cry. I crossed the hallway in 4 strides and pulled him to his feet. Tell me, I said. Tell me all of it. We sat on the floor with our backs against the wall, the cleaning bucket between us. Scott held the dinner bag in his lap but didn't open it. Outside the windows, Charleston's harbor lights blinked in the darkness. He started talking, and I started understanding how a good man disappears. 3 years ago, his wife Emily died. Aneurysm. She was 38 years old, laughing at breakfast, dead before lunch. Scott called me from the hospital, and I've never heard a sound like that come out of a human being, like something fundamental had torn loose inside him. The funeral was a fog. The month after was worse. Scott couldn't work, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything but sit in their house and stare at her empty side of the bed. I stayed with him for weeks. His business partner, Victor Halloway, sent flowers, sent messages, said, "Take all the time you need." 2 months later, Scott dragged himself back to the office. That's when Victor and the company attorney, a man named Richard Chen, who Scott had hired himself, sat him down in the conference room. They had papers, Scott said, his voice flat. Resignation documents, voluntary termination of all shares and executive authority, dated from the week after Emily died. My signature was on every page. I felt something cold move through my chest. You signed them? I don't remember signing them, Dad. I don't remember anything from those weeks. I was on sleeping pills, grief counseling, barely knew what day it was. Victor said he came to the house, said I was lucid, said I told him I couldn't do it anymore and wanted out clean. Scott's hands were shaking. Maybe I did. Maybe I was so broken I just gave up. Or maybe, I said carefully, someone forged your signature when you were too destroyed to fight back. Scott looked at me with hollowed-out eyes. I thought that too. I hired a lawyer, spent my savings on it. The handwriting expert confirmed the signatures matched, but we overlooked the date conflict with Emily's funeral. Either I signed them and don't remember, or they had me sign something else and transferred it, or he trailed off. I lost Dad. I lost everything. The company, my shares, my reputation. Victor spread word that I had a breakdown, that I abandoned the business. Clients believed him. Employees believed him. Why are you working here? I asked. Why this building? His laugh was bitter and broken. Because I can't let go. Stupid, right? I take night janitorial shifts through a contractor service. I clean the floors I used to walk as CEO. I empty trash cans in offices where I used to make decisions worth millions. Victor doesn't even know I'm here. The cleaning company doesn't use our real names on the schedule. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his cheek. I come here because it's the only way I can still be close to what I built. Pathetic, I know. But when I'm here at night, when the building is empty and quiet, I can pretend for a minute that it's still mine, that Emily's still alive, that I didn't lose everything. My boy didn't just lose his company. They stole it while he was burying his wife. I sat there listening to the hum of the building's ventilation system, feeling rage build in my chest like pressure in a boiler. But I'm 68 years old. I learned a long time ago that rage without strategy is just noise. So I asked the questions a construction foreman asks. What's the foundation? What's supporting the structure? What happens if you remove the right piece? Scott, I said slowly, when you started this company, where did you work? He blinked, confused by the change in direction. That old industrial lot off Meeting Street. You helped me buy it. Why? Do you remember whose name is on the deed? I watched understanding try to break through the fog of my son's exhaustion. It didn't reach him yet. 3 years of defeat had trained him not to hope. The deed? He shook his head. Victor controls all the property assets now. Everything transferred with the company's shares. Not everything, I said. 15 years ago, when Scott came to me with his business plan, 27 years old, fresh out of grad school, eyes bright with ambition, I told him what I tell every young man trying to build something. Land first, everything else second. We found that lot together. 3 acres of abandoned industrial property, cracked asphalt and rusted chain link, but zoned commercial and priced right. Scott had enough capital for the purchase and 6 months of operating costs. Not much margin for error. I remember standing in my kitchen the week before closing, watching him sign preliminary paperwork. He was so focused on incorporation documents, business licenses, equipment leases. The land deed sat at the bottom of his priority list. Put my name on it too, I told him. He looked up, surprised. Dad, it's my company, and I'm your father. Humor me. It wasn't sentiment. It was 40 years of watching contractors lose everything because they didn't control the ground beneath their feet. I'd seen men build empires on leased land, only to have landlords triple the rent or sell to developers. I'd seen partners forge documents, ex-wives claim assets, investors pull ground out from under good projects. So Scott added my name, joint tenancy, with right of survivorship. Both signatures required for any transfer or sale. And here's the part Victor Holloway never knew. I kept the original deed in my safe deposit box at First National Bank, and I never recorded the update with the county. It was a construction foreman habit, born from decades of dealing with subcontractors who'd slap a mechanic's lien on your property for a disputed invoice. If the deed wasn't publicly recorded, it couldn't be publicly targeted. We'd update the records later, once the business was stable. and Scott understood the landscape. Later never came. The company grew too fast. Scott got busy. I figured he was smart enough to know what he had. Then Emily died, and Victor made his move. Victor took everything, except the one thing I made sure he'd never find. The property deed was never formally transferred. I told Scott, your shares in the company transferred, your executive authority transferred, but the land this building sits on, Victor doesn't own it. You and I do, together, and he can't change that without both our signatures. Scott stared at me. I could see his mind working, trying to process what this meant. I'm saying Victor Halloway is operating a multi-million-dollar commercial property management firm on land he doesn't legally control. I'm saying every lease he's signed, every mortgage he's refinanced, every asset valuation he's claimed, it's all built on property that still belongs to you and me. Color was returning to my son's face. Not hope yet. He'd been kicked too many times for that. But something sharper. Something that looked like the beginning of a plan. Can we prove it? Original deed is in my safe deposit box. Notarized, filed, legal, never updated. As far as the county records show, this property is still jointly owned by Scott Drummond and Robert Drummond. Victor's lawyers probably assumed the land transferred automatically with the company shares, skipping a full title search in their haste. They were wrong. Scott stood slowly, his janitor uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost too much weight. He looked around the hallway, his hallway, built with his vision and his sweat, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw my son start to remember who he used to be. What do we do? He asked. First, I said, we verify everything. Make sure the deed's still valid. Make sure Victor hasn't somehow filed a fraudulent transfer. Then we confirm the signature on those resignation papers was forged, because I guarantee it was. Then we figure out exactly what Victor's vulnerable to, and we take it all back. He's going to fight. Let him. I picked up his cleaning bucket and dumped the dirty water in the nearby utility sink. A snake can't bite you if you cut off its head. We left the building separately. Scott through the service entrance, carrying his bucket and rags like he'd done 100 nights before. Me through the front lobby, dinner bag in hand, looking like a father who'd stopped by and found his son already gone. No security cameras in the 6th floor hallway, another budget cut that would work in our favor. I sat in my truck in the parking lot and watched Scott's old Honda pull out onto Meeting Street, taillights fading into Charleston's midnight traffic. My phone buzzed. Text from Scott. Thank you. I'd forgotten what hope felt like. I didn't respond. Hope was dangerous until we had facts. I drove home with a construction foreman's mindset. Measure twice, cut once. 43 years in the trades taught me that rushing a job creates mistakes, and mistakes create disasters. Victor Halloway had 3 years of momentum, a building full of employees and lawyers who thought they'd covered every angle, but they'd forgotten the foundation. Every structure needs solid ground. Take that away, and it doesn't matter how impressive the building looks. It's coming down. My house was dark when I pulled in. Margaret's garden still grew along the front walk, maintained now by muscle memory and grief. I unlocked the door and went straight to the kitchen table, pulled out a legal pad, and started making lists. What I knew: Scott's signature on resignation documents, Emily's death date, 2-month absence, Victor's timeline, the deed's status. What I needed: handwriting analysis, timeline verification, Victor's financial records, property transfer history, the name of every person who visited Scott during his grief. What I suspected: Victor had been planning this long before Emily died. He'd just been waiting for an opportunity. I wrote until 2 a.m, then slept 4 hours, and woke to Charleston's dawn coming pink through the bedroom curtains. First stop, First National Bank, safe deposit box, confirm the deed was untouched. Second stop, County Recorder's Office, verify no fraudulent transfers had been filed. Third stop, private investigator I'd worked with during a contractor fraud case in the 90s, man named Carson, retired cop, good instincts. I told my son what I tell every young crew chief who's about to dig a foundation. You can't build anything lasting on lies. but you can sure as hell tear down what someone else built on them. Victor Halloway thought he'd won. He thought my son was broken, invisible, and forgotten. He was wrong about all three, and he was about to learn that in construction, like in justice, everything depends on who controls the ground. The safe deposit box at First National Bank held exactly what I remembered: the original property deed, sealed in a manila envelope I'd marked with the date 15 years ago. My name and Scott's name, typed side by side. Both our signatures at the bottom, notarized by a woman named Helen Birch, who'd since retired to Florida. I photographed every page with my phone, then locked it back in the box. First piece of ammunition secured. Victor's lies weren't just sloppy, they were arrogant, like those of a man who never thought he'd be questioned. The county clerk's office sits in a limestone building downtown that smells like old paper and floor wax. I've been there 100 times over the years. Permit applications, lien releases, subdivision plats. The clerk, a woman named Patricia, who remembered me from a zoning dispute in 2003, pulled the property records for Scott's commercial lot. Nothing's been updated since the original filing, she said, sliding the file across the counter. Still shows joint ownership. Drummond and Drummond. Anyone try to file a transfer? Not in our system. She adjusted her glasses and scrolled through her computer. If someone tried to refinance or sell, it would have been flagged. Requires both signatures. Has that changed? No, ma'am, I said, just confirming what I already knew. Second piece secured. No fraudulent filings. Victor either didn't know about the deed or assumed it had transferred automatically with the corporate shares. Sloppy either way. The next stop was harder. I needed the actual resignation documents, the papers Scott supposedly signed during his grief. Scott had copies, but I wanted the originals. I called his old accountant, a man named Warren Polk, who'd handled Scott's business taxes for a decade. Warren agreed to meet me at a diner off Highway 17. He arrived with a briefcase and the cautious expression of a man who'd seen the aftermath of Scott's downfall. I felt terrible about what happened, Warren said over coffee. Scott was one of my best clients. Sharp, organized, never missed a deadline. Then Emily died and he just disappeared. When Victor showed me the resignation papers, I tried to talk Scott out of it. But Victor said Scott was adamant that he'd already signed. Did you see Scott sign them? Warren's face changed. No, Victor brought them to me already executed. Said Scott signed them at home, wanted everything finalized quickly. I filed them with the corporate documents because Victor was listed as the remaining principal. I had no reason to question it. Can I see them? He pulled a folder from his briefcase. 3 pages, legal size, dense corporate language. Scott's signature on each page. Dated April 14th, 3 years ago. I knew that date. It was burned into my memory because I'd been standing next to Scott at his wife's funeral in Burlington, Vermont. We'd flown up together. The service was at noon. We didn't fly back until the 16th. Scott couldn't have signed these documents in Charleston on the 14th because he was 600 miles away, burying the woman he loved. And somehow, my son's initial lawyer missed this glaring timeline discrepancy during his challenge. I pulled out my phone and showed Warren the photos I'd taken that day. Scott at the funeral, the memorial service program with the date, the hotel receipt from Burlington. Warren's face went pale. He was in Vermont, I said quietly. The entire week. Provable, documented. So either Scott has the ability to be in 2 places at once, or someone forged his signature while he was mourning his wife. Warren set down his coffee cup. His hand was shaking. Jesus Christ. I kept digging. The notary stamp on the resignation papers belonged to Richard Chen, Scott's former attorney, the same man who'd helped Victor execute the takeover. A lawyer notarizing documents for his own client in a transaction where he had financial interest. That alone was an ethical violation worth disbarment. But it got worse. I compared the signatures on the resignation papers to contracts I'd saved from Scott's early projects, purchase orders, vendor agreements, client proposals. I'm not a handwriting expert, but I've read enough signatures on change orders to know when something's off. The resignation signature was close but wrong. The capital S in Scott was too angular. The loop in the D of Drummond was too tight. Someone had practiced Scott's signature and gotten it 90% right. Good enough to fool a casual observer, not good enough to fool a father who'd watched his son sign his name 1,000 times. I photographed everything: the original resignation papers, the funeral documentation, the old contracts, the notary stamps. Every piece of evidence that proved Victor Halloway hadn't just stolen a company. He'd fabricated an entire timeline, forged legal documents, and committed fraud sophisticated enough to send him to prison. But I wasn't going to the police. Not yet. Because men like Victor don't just commit one crime. They commit dozens, and they get sloppy once they think they've won. I had 4 days of investigation ahead of me, and I intended to find every crack in Victor's foundation. On the 3rd day of digging, I found Diane's name in the corporate records, and my blood went cold. Scott's ex-wife had signed an affidavit, dated 2 weeks after the supposed resignation, testifying that Scott was mentally unstable and incapable of rational business decisions during his bereavement period. Her statement gave Victor legal cover, evidence that Scott's judgment was compromised, that the resignation was actually merciful, that Victor was protecting the company from a CEO in crisis. It was poison dressed up as concern. Diane didn't just abandon my son. She sold him out for a paycheck while his wife's grave was still fresh. I'd never liked Diane. Scott married her young, 26 years old, fresh out of grad school, thinking love and ambition could coexist with a woman who wanted neither. The marriage lasted 2 years. No kids, thank God. She left him for a pharmaceutical rep from Charlotte and walked away with half his savings and none of his respect. That was 14 years ago. Scott moved on, built his business, met Emily, found the kind of partnership Diane could never provide. I thought Diane was gone, a closed chapter, a lesson learned. I was wrong. I called a private investigator named Carson Briggs, former Charleston PD, now retired and running a small firm out of Mount Pleasant. Carson had helped me track down a subcontractor who'd embezzled $60,000 from a hospital project back in '98. He was thorough, discreet, and mean as a snake when he needed to be. I need everything on Diane Hartwell, I told him. Her finances, her employment, her connection to Victor Halloway. Carson called me back 8 hours later. Your ex-daughter-in-law has been on Victor's payroll for 3 years, he said. Consulting contract, business development, $18,000 a month, paid like clockwork. No documented work product, no client meetings, no deliverables. It's hush money. $18,000 a month, $216,000 a year. For 3 years, nearly $650,000 paid to Scott's ex-wife to keep her mouth shut and her affidavit unchallenged. There's more, Carson said. Diane and Victor went to USC together. Same graduating class, same business program. They weren't close, different social circles, but they knew each other. I found photos from an alumni mixer 2 years before Emily died. Diane and Victor, cocktails in hand, looking friendly. The timeline clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. Victor hadn't improvised this theft when Emily died. He'd been planning it for months, jealous of Scott's success, waiting for an opportunity. And when tragedy struck, he'd called an old college acquaintance who happened to be Scott's bitter ex-wife, leveraging their USC connection from an alumni event where they reconnected 2 years prior, and they'd orchestrated the whole thing together, premeditated, calculated, built on my son's grief like vultures feeding on roadkill. I sat in my truck outside Carson's office and felt something harden inside my chest. This wasn't just business fraud anymore. This was personal betrayal, layered and deliberate, executed by people who'd looked Scott in the eye and pretended to care. Diane had sent flowers to Emily's funeral. I remembered because Scott had commented on them. White lilies, expensive arrangement, card signed, with deepest sympathy. 2 weeks later, she'd signed a legal document calling him mentally unstable and cashed the first of 36 payments. I called Scott that night. He was between janitorial shifts, eating dinner in his car outside a convenience store. Did you know Diane was on Victor's payroll? I asked. Silence. Then, what? Consulting contract. $18,000 a month since the takeover. Nearly $650,000 total. She testified you were incompetent, gave Victor the legal cover he needed, and got paid enough to retire on. More silence. I could hear him breathing, processing. The way you process a wound you didn't know you had until someone pointed out the blood. She was at Emily's funeral, he said finally. His voice was flat, empty. She hugged me, told me if I needed anything, she was there. She was there, I said, counting down the days until Victor's first payment cleared. Scott didn't respond. I didn't push. Some betrayals need silence to settle in before rage can grow. We're going to take them both down, I said. Not just Victor, both of them. You understand? Yeah, Scott said. I understand. I had 2 targets now, and the trap I was building would catch them both. While Carson worked on Diane's finances, I spent 2 days researching what Victor had done with Scott's company. What I found made my hands shake. Under Scott's leadership, Meridian Commercial Solutions had been lean and ethical. 28 employees, fair pricing, reputation built on quality work and honest dealing. Client reviews praised Scott's integrity. Contractors liked working with him because he paid on time and didn't nickel and dime change orders. Under Victor, the company had become something else entirely. Victor didn't just steal my son's company, he's gutting it like a pig, selling off pieces for parts. Employee count had ballooned to 47, but half were administrative redundancies, assistants for assistants, coordinators who coordinated nothing. Victor's nephew, a 29-year-old with a liberal arts degree and no financial experience, was now CFO with a salary of $160,000. Client reviews had collapsed. Complaints about inflated bids, missed deadlines, shoddy subcontractor work. Projects that used to take 3 months were dragging into 6. Invoices that used to be transparent were now full of mysterious consulting fees and administrative costs. I found a thread on a commercial real estate forum where property managers warned each other about Meridian's new practices, bait and switch pricing, low bids that doubled after contracts were signed, threats of mechanics' liens over disputed charges. One post, from a facilities director at a medical complex, said, "Meridian used to be the gold standard. I don't know what happened, but it's not the same company. Scott Drummond built something special. Whoever's running it now is running it into the ground." The worst part? Victor had sold Scott's proprietary software, a project management platform Scott developed in-house, to a competitor in Atlanta for $200,000. Scott had spent years building that system, refining it, making it the backbone of the company's efficiency. Victor sold it like scrap metal. I pulled tax records through Carson's connections. Victor had tripled his own salary to $420,000, installed himself in Scott's old corner office, and paid out nearly $1 million in executive bonuses to himself and his inner circle. The company was hemorrhaging money, surviving only on the client base Scott had spent 15 years building. But that base was eroding fast. In another 2 years, maybe 3, Meridian would collapse under its own bloated incompetence. Victor wasn't just a thief, he was a parasite, feeding on a host he was killing from the inside. I realized then that this wasn't just about getting Scott's company back. It was about saving it before Victor destroyed everything Scott had built. Every month Victor stayed in control was another month of damage. Reputation ruined, relationships burned, legacy dismantled. The urgency tightened like a vice around my ribs. I couldn't just win. I had to win fast. On the 7th day, I visited Martin Hendricks, a retired real estate attorney I'd worked with during union negotiations back in the 80s. Martin was 74 now, sharp as ever, running a solo practice out of his house on James Island. I spread the documents across his kitchen table, the deed, the resignation papers, the funeral receipts, Diane's affidavit, Victor's financial records. Martin read everything twice, then looked up with the expression of a man who just watched someone commit malpractice. "This deed gives you nuclear authority," he said. "Joint ownership means you can evict any occupant, individual or corporate. with 30 days' notice. Victor doesn't own the land. He can't operate a commercial business on property he doesn't control. You could shut him down tomorrow. What about the forgery? Criminal fraud? Mail fraud, if any of these documents crossed state lines? Victor's looking at federal charges, disbarment for his attorney, conspiracy charges for Diane. Martin tapped the funeral receipts. This timeline evidence is airtight. Scott was in Vermont. The signature is forged. Any prosecutor would take this case. I'm not going to prosecutors, I said. Not yet. Martin raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because I want Victor to surrender the company voluntarily. I want him to walk away knowing he lost, knowing he got caught, knowing he has no moves left. And I want to give him that choice, publicly, in front of the board, where everyone can see what he did. I built foundations for 40 years. I know exactly how to make a crooked structure collapse. Martin helped me draft a formal notice to vacate, printed on legal letterhead, citing my authority as co-owner of the property, 30 days to remove all personnel, equipment, and records, or face eviction proceedings and trespassing charges. Then we found something beautiful, Scott's old shareholder proxy, a document giving him the right to attend board meetings as a former founder. Victor had never properly dissolved it, because Victor's lawyers were arrogant and sloppy. Technically, it was still valid, which meant Scott could attend the quarterly board meeting scheduled for next Thursday, and I could come as his guest. You're going to walk in there with the deed and the notice to vacate? Martin asked. I'm going to walk in there with evidence of fraud, proof of forgery, documentation of conspiracy, and a choice. Victor surrenders the company, reinstates Scott as CEO, and faces only civil penalties, or he refuses, loses the building, faces criminal charges, and gets destroyed publicly. He'll lawyer up. Let him. His lawyers will tell him the same thing you're telling me. He's already lost. The only question is how much damage he takes on the way down. Martin smiled, the cold smile of a man who'd spent 40 years watching bad people get what they deserved. When's the meeting? Thursday, 10 a.m. Conference room on the 7th floor. Good luck, Martin said. And Robert, make it hurt. I drove home as the sun set over Charleston Harbor, turning the water the color of old copper. I stopped at Scott's apartment, a one-bedroom place off Savannah Highway, the kind of place a man lives when he's given up on ever owning anything again. Thursday morning, I told him, I'm going to the board meeting alone. If this works, I'll call you immediately. Stay ready. Scott looked confused. You're not taking me? Not yet. I need to control the room first. Present the evidence without Victor seeing you. Once he's cornered, once the board understands what happened, then you arrive. Trust me on this. He nodded slowly, trusting what he couldn't yet see. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Tomorrow, I went to war. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. I woke at 5:30, showered, and dressed in my best suit, navy blue, the one I'd bought for Margaret's funeral 5 years ago and hadn't worn since. Simple, blue-collar Sunday formal, the kind of suit a man wears when he's serious but not trying to impress anyone. I prepared for the meeting alone, planning to call Scott afterward if successful. I pulled into Meridian's parking lot at 9:45. The building looked different in daylight, less like a crown, more like a monument to something stolen. I walked into that boardroom the same way I walked onto job sites for 40 years, like I owned the place, because I did. The receptionist was young, early 20s, and didn't recognize me. I presented Scott's old shareholder proxy, the document Martin had helped me locate, signed and notarized 12 years ago, giving Scott Drummond permanent board observer status as founding principal. She looked confused and called security. 2 guards arrived, read the document, and exchanged glances. One made a phone call. 3 minutes later, I was cleared through. 7th floor, the guard said. Conference room A. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. When the doors opened, I could smell the coffee and leather and expensive cologne that wealthy men wear to feel important. The conference room had mahogany paneling, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Charleston Harbor, and a table that could seat 20. 8 executives sat around it, reviewing quarterly reports. Victor Halloway sat at the head, 48 years old, sharp-suited in charcoal pinstripe, silver cufflinks catching the light, hair professionally styled. He looked like success, talked like success, carried himself like a man who'd never lost anything. He barely glanced up when I entered. I took an empty seat halfway down the table, proceeding alone as planned. The executives looked at me with mild curiosity, the way you look at people who might be lost, but probably aren't worth acknowledging. Victor flipped a page in his report. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" His tone was dismissive, bored, the voice of a man addressing an interruption. I set my briefcase on the table, opened it slowly, and met his eyes. "I'm Robert Drummond," I said, "co-owner of the property you're sitting on. I'm here to discuss your lease." The room went silent. Victor's smirk faltered. He set down his pen and really looked at me for the first time, taking in the worn suit, the calloused hands, the gray hair. "I'm sorry," Victor said, his voice smooth as oil. "We don't have a landlord. This property is owned by Meridian Commercial Solutions." "No," I said calmly, "it's not." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the first document. The game had begun. Victor leaned back in his chair, projecting the kind of confidence that comes from 3 years of unchallenged power. His attorney, a thin man in wire-rimmed glasses sitting 2 seats down, was already pulling out his phone. "Mr. Drummond," Victor said, "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, but this is a private board meeting. If you have a property dispute, you can contact our legal department and—" I placed the deed on the table. Original document, notarized 15 years ago by Helen Birch, whose signature was as clear today as it was in 2010. 2 names typed in official print, Robert Drummond and Scott Drummond. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. 3 acres, Meeting Street, Charleston, South Carolina. The paper was crisp, preserved in a protective sleeve, marked with the county seal. When Victor saw that deed, I watched 15 years of arrogance evaporate in 15 seconds. His face was drained of color. The attorney scrambled forward, snatching the document, reading it with the frantic energy of a man watching his client step on a landmine. "This can't be valid," the attorney said. Property records show what was recorded with the county," I interrupted. "This deed was never updated in the public system, filed with the county clerk, but never transferred through a formal recording process. It's a quirk from the early days of Scott's company. We planned to update it, but life got busy. Then Emily died, and other things took priority. I let that sink in. Emily's name was intentional, a reminder that they'd stolen this company during Scott's grief. The point is," I continued, "this deed gives me and Scott joint ownership of this land. Every lease you've signed, every corporate filing listing this property as an asset, every loan you've secured using this building as collateral, all of it is built on a foundation you don't own." Victor's attorney was scrolling frantically through his phone, cross-referencing property records, his face growing paler with each search. He looked up at Victor and gave the smallest shake of his head. Confirmed. The deed was real. Victor found his voice, but it came out thin. This is obviously a complicated legal matter. We'll need time to review. To consult with." I slid a second document across the table. "Notice to vacate," printed on Martin Hendrix's legal letterhead. "Addressed to Meridian Commercial Solutions and all occupants of 1847 Meeting Street. Effective date, 30 days from today. Grounds, unauthorized occupancy of privately owned property. You have 30 days to remove all personnel, equipment, and records from this building," I said. "After that, you're trespassing, and I'll have the sheriff's department escort you out." One of the board members, a silver-haired man in his 60s who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Victor, what the hell is going on?" Victor ignored him, his eyes locked on mine. I could see his mind racing, looking for angles, trying to find the crack in my strategy. "This is absurd," Victor said, but his voice had lost its command. "Scott sold me this company voluntarily. I have documentation, signed resignation papers, Everything filed properly with, "You have forged documents," I said quietly, "and I can prove it." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victor's attorney put a hand on his arm, a silent warning to shut up. But Victor was past caution now. He was drowning, and drowning men thrash. "You can't just walk in here and make accusations," Victor said, his voice rising. "I built this company into what it is today. I saved it from a CEO who was falling apart. Scott abandoned this business, and I stepped into—" "Scott was burying his wife," I said, and my voice cut through his bluster like a blade. "And while he was in Vermont, saying goodbye to the woman he loved, you forged his signature on resignation papers and stole everything he built." I opened my briefcase again. Time to show them exactly how deep the grave was that Victor had dug for himself. I pulled out a folder, manila, worn at the edges, stuffed with documents that represented 7 days of methodical investigation. I placed it on the table between us. "Let's talk about April 14th, 3 years ago," I said. "The date on Scott's resignation papers. The day he supposedly signed away his company, his shares, his life's work." Victor's jaw tightened. "He signed them, voluntarily, in front of witnesses." "No," I said. "He was 600 miles away." I removed the first document from the folder. Emily's funeral program. Trinity Episcopal Church, Burlington, Vermont. Service date, April 14th. I laid it on the table where everyone could see. "Scott's wife died on April 9th, I said. "The funeral was 5 days later in her hometown. Scott and I flew to Vermont on the 12th. We didn't return to Charleston until the 16th. Next document, airline receipts. Charleston to Burlington. 2 tickets, dated April 12th. Return flight, April 16th. Next, the hotel bill from the Burlington Marriott. 4 nights, checked out on the 16th. Next, the funeral home invoice, signed by Scott on April 14th, the same day his resignation was supposedly signed in Charleston. Victor thought he'd buried the evidence, but he forgot that old construction guys keep every receipt, every document, every scrap of proof. The board members were leaning forward now, studying the papers, their faces shifting from confusion to understanding to horror. "So either Scott has the ability to be in 2 places at once," I said, "or someone forged his signature while he was mourning his wife. Which do you think is more likely?" Victor's attorney was whispering urgently in his ear. Victor waved him off, his face flushed red. "The signatures were authenticated," Victor said. "We had a handwriting expert confirm." "You had an expert confirm signatures that looked close enough to fool a casual observer," I interrupted, "but they're not perfect." I pulled out copies of old contracts, purchase orders Scott had signed 5 years before Emily's death, vendor agreements with his authentic signature, client proposals in his own hand. I laid them beside the resignation papers. "Look at the capital S in Scott," I said, pointing. "On the authentic documents, the loop is loose, almost lazy. On the resignation papers, it's tight, controlled. Look at the D in Drummond. The real signature has an open loop. Forged signature closes it." The silver-haired board member picked up both documents, comparing them under the light. His expression darkened. "And here's the interesting part," I continued. "The resignation was notarized by Richard Chen, Victor's personal attorney, the same lawyer who helped execute this takeover. That's a conflict of interest so blatant it's grounds for disbarment." Victor's face was the color of concrete now. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "But wait," I said. "There's more." I pulled out the final document, Diane's consulting contract, $18,000 per month, effective April 21st, 1 week after the supposed resignation. No deliverables specified, no work product required, just monthly payments totaling over $600,000 across 3 years. "Scott's ex-wife," I said, "signed an affidavit claiming he was mentally unstable during his bereavement. She testified that his judgment was compromised, giving Victor legal cover for the takeover. And 7 days later, Victor put her on payroll for $216,000 a year." I turned to Victor. "That's called witness tampering. That's called bribery. And combined with the forged signature and the fraudulent notarization, That's called felony fraud. The room was silent except for someone's pen rolling off the table and hitting the floor. The silver-haired board member, his nameplate read, James Pritchard, CFO, stood up slowly. Victor, tell me this isn't true. Victor opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His attorney tried to salvage it. These allegations are serious, and we'll need to conduct a full investigation before... The investigation's done, I said. I've got handwriting analysis from a certified forensic expert. I've got travel records that prove timeline fraud. I've got witness payments that establish conspiracy. You didn't buy this company, Victor. You forged documents, bribed a witness, and stole it from a grieving man. That's not a business transaction. That's a crime, and it's a felony. James Pritchard sat down heavily, looking like a man who just discovered his ship was sinking. The other board members were pulling out their phones, texting attorneys, already distancing themselves from the wreckage. On the video screen mounted on the wall, I saw Diane's face. She'd been attending via video call, silent until now. When she heard the word bribery, her expression crumbled. The screen went black. She disconnected. Coward. Victor sat frozen, his empire collapsing around him in real time. And I wasn't done yet. I let the silence stretch, let them sit in it, let Victor feel the walls closing in. Then I leaned forward, folded my hands on the table, and spoke in the same calm voice I'd used to deliver safety briefings on construction sites for 43 years. Here's what happens next, I said. Victor's attorney started to object, but I raised one hand, just one, and he stopped. You have two choices, Victor. Only two. I pulled out a document Martin Hendricks had prepared, a transfer agreement restoring full ownership of Meridian Commercial Solutions to Scott Drummond. Shares, assets, intellectual property, corporate control, everything. Choice one. You and Diane sign this document right now, today, this instant. Everything reverts to Scott. You walk away with nothing but your freedom. I don't file criminal charges, I don't pursue civil damages, and I chose not to pursue criminal charges to focus on restoration. You and Diane disappear, and we never speak of this again. Victor's face was gray. His hands were shaking. Choice two. You refuse. I evict this company in 30 days. I file felony fraud charges with the district attorney. I've already spoken with him, and he's very interested in the case. I pursue every dollar you stole, every asset you liquidated, every fraudulent payment you made. Diane goes down with you. Your attorney loses his license, and you spend the next 5 years in court, followed by however long a judge decides you belong in prison. I gave Victor the same choice I'd give any thief: return what you stole and walk away, or lose everything, including your freedom. The clock on the wall ticked, loud in the silence, each second a countdown. You have 2 minutes to decide, I said. Victor's attorney was whispering frantically, but I could read his lips. Take the deal. Take the deal. They have everything. James Pritchard stood up. Victor, if any of this is true, and it clearly is, then this company has massive liability exposure. I'm formally recommending as CFO that you accept Mr. Drummond's terms immediately. Another board member nodded. Then another. The rats were abandoning the ship in real time. You broke my son, I said quietly. You stole his company while he was burying his wife. You turned his ex-wife against him. You made him invisible in his own building. And you did it all because you were too small to build something yourself. Victor flinched like he'd been slapped. Sign the papers, I said, and get out of his company. 90 seconds had passed. Victor reached for the pen with a hand that trembled so badly he could barely grip it. His attorney slid the transfer agreement in front of him, already open to the signature page. Victor signed. His signature was barely legible, nothing like the confident flourish he'd used on documents for 3 years. I pulled out my phone and called Diane. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick. You need to sign the transfer documents, I said. I'm sending them electronically right now. Sign and return them within the hour, or I'm filing charges. I can't. You can, and you will. She signed remotely within 40 minutes. The documents returned via secure email without her ever facing anyone. I collected the documents, placed them in my briefcase, and stood. "You have until 5 p.m. today to clear out your office," I told Victor. "Security will escort you. If you're still in this building tomorrow morning, you're trespassing on property you don't own, and I'll have you arrested." Victor didn't respond. He just sat there, deflated, destroyed, a man who'd built an empire on lies and watched it collapse in 30 minutes. I turned to the board. "Scott Drummond will be here shortly. He's your CEO again, effective immediately. I suggest you start acting like it." I stood, collected the documents, and walked out of that conference room with my head high. In the lobby, I called Scott. "It's done," I said. "Come to the building, 7th floor boardroom. Your company is waiting." Victor's signature on the transfer agreement was shaky, barely legible, the handwriting of a man whose world had just collapsed. His attorney, Richard Chen, witnessed it with the grim expression of someone already calculating his own legal exposure. The board members sat in stunned silence, while James Pritchard read through the document one final time, verifying every clause, every provision, every word that stripped Victor Halloway of power he'd never legitimately held. "This transfers all shares, all corporate authority, all assets, including intellectual property, back to Scott Drummond, effective immediately," Pritchard said. He looked around the table. "I move to accept this transfer and formally reinstate Scott Drummond as CEO and majority shareholder of Meridian Commercial Solutions." "Second," said another board member immediately. The vote was unanimous. 8 hands raised. No discussion needed. I'd called Scott from the boardroom 20 minutes earlier. He arrived within that time, still in his gray janitor uniform, work boots leaving faint marks on the marble hallway. His face was pale, confused, terrified that something had gone wrong. When Scott walked into that boardroom in his janitor's uniform and saw his name back on those papers, I saw my boy come back to life. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the board members staring at him. Victor slumped in his chair like a defeated boxer, the documents spread across the table bearing his own name in fresh ink. "What?" Scott's voice broke. "What happened?" I stood and crossed to him, placed the corporate seal in his hands, the physical stamp that authenticated company documents, the symbol of authority Victor had carried for 3 years. "It's yours again, son," I said. "All of it." Then I handed him the original property deed, the document that had saved everything, the building, the company, your reputation, your life's work. We got it all back. Scott's legs gave out. He collapsed into the nearest chair, the corporate seal clutched in both hands, his shoulders shaking. The sound that came out of him wasn't quite crying, wasn't quite laughing. It was the release of 3 years of grief and humiliation and loss, all pouring out at once. I put my hand on his shoulder and let him feel it. Around the table, the board members looked away, giving him privacy in his moment. Even they, corporate men who'd probably never scrubbed a baseboard in their lives, understood what this meant. Victor stood slowly, his expensive suit somehow looking cheaper now, like costume jewelry exposed to sunlight. He moved toward the door without a word. "Security will escort you," Pritchard said coldly. "You have 1 hour to collect personal items from your office. Everything else stays." Victor nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and walked out. His attorney followed, already on his phone with what sounded like his own lawyer. The boardroom emptied gradually, executives making quiet exits, murmuring about emergency meetings and damage control. Within 10 minutes, only Scott and I remained, sitting in the leather chairs, looking out at the harbor through floor-to-ceiling windows. The building was silent except for Scott's breathing, gradually steadying. "How did you do it?" he asked finally. "I remembered what I taught you when you were 16, I said. "Control the ground, control everything, and always, always, keep the originals." Scott laughed, a real laugh, raw and exhausted but genuine. The deed, I confirmed. Victor thought he'd taken everything. He forgot about the one thing he couldn't see. Scott looked at the corporate seal in his hands, then at the transfer documents bearing his name. "I'm CEO again," he said. like he was testing the words. "You were always CEO," I said. "You just got robbed for a while. Now you're back." The next morning, Scott arrived at 6 a.m., not because he had to, but because that's who he was. Not as a returning king, but as the man who'd built this company from dirt and sweat and wouldn't rebuild it any other way. Scott didn't stride back in like some corporate king. He walked in the same way he walked onto his first job site 20 years ago, ready to work. I wasn't there to see it, but he told me later. He walked through every floor, starting in the basement and working up. On the 3rd floor, he passed a woman from accounting who'd known him as the night janitor. She did a double take. "Scott, what are you doing here so early?" "I work here," he said simply. "Actually, I own here." Long story. Over the next week, word was spreading through Charleston's commercial construction community. Scott Drummond was back. On the 4th floor, a small crowd had gathered. Employees who'd heard rumors, who'd seen security escort Victor out the day before, who were trying to piece together what had happened. Scott gathered them in the main conference room and explained in plain terms. There had been a theft 3 years ago. Documents had been forged. His father had corrected it. He was back. No grandstanding, no dramatic speeches, just the facts, delivered the way a construction foreman delivers a safety briefing. Clear, direct, move on. Then he went to his office, Victor's office until yesterday, and started working. The first thing he did was review every active project. What he found made his jaw tighten. Inflated bids, shoddy work, delayed timelines, subcontractors being squeezed on payment terms while Victor padded invoices. Scott started making calls. First call, Marcus Thompson, a plumbing contractor who'd worked with Scott for 10 years before Victor cut him out and replaced him with a cheaper, less reliable company. "Marcus, it's Scott Drummond. I'm back at Meridian, and I need to apologize. Victor treated you like garbage, inflated costs that should have gone to you, and blamed delays on your work when you weren't even on the project. That was wrong. I'm making it right." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then, "Scott, Jesus, man, I heard you'd... Where have you been?" "That's a long story, but I'm fixing what got broken. Are you available for the Riverside Medical Project? I'm pulling Victor's contractor and I need someone who does the work right." Over the following days, word continued to spread. Scott had called 6 subcontractors personally by the end of the week, apologizing for Victor's mismanagement and offering to make amends. By the 2nd week, 3 former clients called to discuss projects they'd pulled when Victor's incompetence became obvious. 2 wanted to reinstate their contracts immediately. Scott rebuilt the same way he'd built the first time. 1 honest relationship at a time, 1 phone call at a time, 1 project managed with integrity. He didn't fire Victor's hires immediately. That would have been cruel and impractical. Instead, he evaluated each person based on competence. The nephew CFO was gone by Friday, but several mid-level managers who'd been trying their best under Victor's chaos were kept on and given clear expectations. That first week, Scott worked 14-hour days, not because he had to prove anything, but because there was damage to repair, and he was the only one who could repair it. On Friday evening, I stopped by his office. He was at his desk, reviewing project proposals, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. "You don't have to kill yourself," I said from the doorway. He looked up and smiled, tired but genuine. "I'm not killing myself, Dad. I'm healing myself. Every call I make, every contractor I apologize to, every project I fix, it's like I'm stitching something back together." I nodded. I understood. Work wasn't punishment for Scott. It was medicine. "Just remember to eat," I said, "and sleep occasionally." "I will," he promised. "But Dad, thank you for all of it, for remembering the deed, for fighting when I couldn't. That's a father's role," I said. I left him there, working in the office he'd built, restoring the company he'd created, proving that some things can't be stolen permanently if they're built on solid ground. I stood in the 6th floor hallway the following Tuesday, watching Scott through the glass wall of a conference room. He was meeting with a client, a hospital facilities director who'd worked with him years ago. They were laughing about something, shaking hands, The kind of easy professional rapport that can't be faked. I spent 40 years teaching my son to build foundations that last. I just never thought I'd have to use one to save him. But watching him now, I realized that's exactly what I'd done. For 43 years, I'd taught young men on construction sites the same lessons my father taught me. Build it right, document everything, control your ground, and never trust that the world will protect you. Those weren't just construction principles. They were life principles. I'd taught Scott to be honest because dishonest men can't sleep at night. I'd taught him to keep records because memory fails and paper doesn't. I'd taught him to secure his foundation because everything else is just decoration. And when Victor Halloway came hunting, when he found my son broken by grief, vulnerable, and undefended, those foundations held, the deed I'd insisted on, the records I'd saved, the old school habit of keeping originals in a safe deposit box, because you never know when you'll need proof. Scott's tragedy wasn't a weakness. Grief isn't a weakness. Loving someone so much that their death destroys you for a while, that's not failure. That's being human. His tragedy was being surrounded by predators who saw vulnerability as opportunity. But the foundation I'd built, not in concrete and rebar, but in lessons and habits and a father's foresight, held firm when everything else collapsed. I thought about all the buildings I'd worked on over the decades. Office towers and hospitals and schools and houses, hundreds of structures, maybe thousands. I'd poured foundations that would outlast me, framed walls that would stand for generations. But none of that was my real legacy. My real legacy was the son I'd raised to build honestly, to work with integrity, to treat people fairly. And when the world tried to take that from him, my legacy was having the tools to fight back. I'd spent my whole life building things. But this, saving Scott's company, restoring his dignity, giving him back what thieves had stolen, this was the only thing I'd built that truly mattered. Scott finished his meeting and walked the client to the elevator. He saw me standing in the hallway and smiled, waved. I waved back. He didn't need me anymore. Not to fight his battles, not to save him from villains. He was whole again. Scarred, maybe, but whole. My work was complete. I took the elevator down, walked through the lobby where Scott's name would soon be restored to the directory, and drove home through Charleston's afternoon traffic. That night, I slept the way a man sleeps when he's finished something important, deep and dreamless, and at peace. 6 months later, I met Scott for Sunday dinner at a seafood place on Shem Creek. Our routine now, every week without fail. He looked different than he had in that boardroom, 10 pounds heavier, color back in his face, eyes that met yours instead of sliding away. "The company's doing well," he said, over shrimp and grits. "We closed the Riverside medical contract last week. 3-year project, $8 million. They said they came back because they trust us again." "They trust you," I corrected. "They always did." He smiled. "Same thing. That janitor uniform hanging in Scott's office isn't a trophy. It's a reminder that you can lose everything except who you are." Scott had framed it. The gray uniform, cleaned and pressed, mounted in a shadow box on the wall behind his desk, where everyone could see it. Below it, a small brass plate. April 2022, January 2026, 3 years of perseverance. When clients asked about it, Scott told them the truth. He'd lost everything, worked as a janitor in his own building, and clawed his way back. Some thought it was inspirational. Others thought it was strange. Scott didn't care. It reminded him daily that a title doesn't define dignity, and that some foundations can't be stolen. Victor and Diane had disappeared from Charleston. Both faced civil lawsuits from clients who'd been defrauded during Victor's management. Inflated invoices, substandard work, breach of contract. They'd settled quietly, paid restitution, and left South Carolina entirely. Last I heard, Victor was selling insurance in Tampa. Diane had moved back to Charlotte. Neither would work in commercial real estate again. Reputation matters in small industries, and word had spread about what they'd done. The property deed was now officially recorded with the county, all documentation properly filed. Scott had insisted on buying out my share of the land, fair market value, no family discount. I'd declined 3 times before accepting a symbolic transaction, $1 and a brass plaque in the lobby. The plaque read, Meridian Commercial Solutions, founded by Scott Drummond, protected by Robert Drummond, built on honest ground. Scott had it installed without telling me. I didn't see it until I visited for a project review meeting. When I did, my throat got tight and I had to excuse myself for a minute. We finished dinner and walked out to the parking lot, the spring air warm and thick with salt. Scott paused before getting in his truck. I never asked you, he said. Why did you keep that deed separate? Why never record it officially? I thought about it, about the contractor disputes I'd seen, the partners who'd betrayed each other, the hard lessons learned over decades of watching good men lose everything because they hadn't protected their foundation. Because I knew, I said simply, not what would happen exactly, but I knew the world was full of people who'd take what you built if you gave them half a chance. So I made sure there was one thing they couldn't take, even if everything else burned down. Scott nodded slowly. You saved me, Dad. No, I said. I gave you the tools to save yourself. You did the rest. We hugged, brief and tight, the way men who've been through war hug, and drove home separately into the Charleston dusk. That night, alone in my house with Margaret's garden blooming in the darkness outside, I thought about legacy, not the buildings I'd worked on or the crews I'd led or the projects I'd completed, but this, a son restored, a company rebuilt, a father's promise kept. Some foundations last forever, if they're built right. If you've made it this far, you deserve to know what this story really means, because it's not just about a stolen company or a forged signature or a father who saved his son. It's about something older and deeper. Lessons I learned over 43 years of building things that last. The deed that saved my son wasn't luck. It was a decision I made 15 years ago to protect what he was building, just in case. And that's the first lesson. Documentation is dignity. Every contract I saved, every receipt I kept, every original document I locked in that safe deposit box, those weren't the habits of a paranoid man. They were the habits of a man who'd watched good people lose everything because they couldn't prove what they knew was true. In construction, we have a saying, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. That applies to job sites, and it applies to life. When Scott was building his company, I didn't keep that deed separate because I suspected Victor Halloway would steal the business 15 years later. I kept it separate because I'd seen partners betray each other, investors manipulate contracts, family members contest inheritances. I'd watched honest men lose decades of work because they'd trusted handshakes over paperwork. So I made a choice. Trust Scott's partners, but verify the foundation, keep the originals, maintain the records, build one layer of protection that nobody else controlled. That decision, made on a Tuesday afternoon in 2010 while standing in a county clerk's office, saved my son's entire life in 2026. The second lesson, grief makes us vulnerable, and predators know it. Victor didn't steal Scott's company because he was smarter or more capable. He stole it because he recognized the moment when Scott couldn't defend himself, when Emily's death had torn a hole through my son's life so large, he couldn't see clearly, couldn't think straight, couldn't protect what he'd built. Predators don't attack strength. They attack wounds, and grief is the deepest wound there is. If you're watching this and you've lost someone, a spouse, a parent, a child, understand that the weeks and months after that loss are when you're most exposed. That's when bad people make their moves. That's when you sign papers you shouldn't sign, agree to terms you shouldn't accept, trust people you shouldn't trust. The third lesson, patience and preparation defeat arrogance and haste. Victor thought he'd won. He had 3 years of unchallenged power, a building full of employees, lawyers who assured him everything was legal. He got comfortable, he got sloppy, but I spent 7 days investigating before I made a single move. I collected evidence, verified facts, consulted experts, built a case so airtight that Victor had no defense. I didn't rush in with rage. I walked in with proof. That's how you win wars. Not with anger, but with preparation. Not with volume, but with facts. Not by fighting harder, but by fighting smarter. The fourth lesson, and this is the one I want you to remember, is that a father's quiet protection, planted years in advance, can save a son's life decades later. I didn't save Scott's company in that boardroom. I saved it in 2010 when I insisted my name go on the deed. I saved it every time I filed an original document in my safe deposit box, instead of throwing it away. I saved it every time I taught Scott to document everything, to keep records, to control his foundation. Protection isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just filing a paper correctly. Sometimes it's just keeping a receipt. Sometimes it's making a decision nobody will understand until the disaster hits. I'm asking you, everyone watching this, to think about the people you love, your children, your grandchildren, your brothers, your friends. What foundations are you building for them? What protections are you planting that might save them 10, 15, 20 years from now? Keep the papers. Remember the dates. Take photos of important documents. Back up the files. Make copies. Store originals safely. Because thieves can steal companies. They can steal money. They can steal years of your life. But they can't steal preparation. They can't steal the deed you filed correctly. They can't steal the records you preserved. They can't steal the foundation you built when times were good, so it would hold when times went bad. That's what this story teaches. Old school habits aren't paranoia. They're wisdom passed down from men who learned the hard way. Trust people, love people, build things with people, but protect the foundation. Always protect the foundation. Because someday, someone you love might need it to survive. I want to speak directly to two groups of people watching this. First, to the fathers, the men my age, maybe older, maybe younger, but carrying the weight that fathers carry. Your children will face battles you can't fight for them. That's the hardest truth of fatherhood. You can't protect them from heartbreak, from loss, from people who'll lie to them or cheat them or hurt them. You can't be there for every moment when life comes at them hard, but you can arm them. Not with money, money runs out. Not with connections, connections fade. But with preparation, with values, with the knowledge that you're watching and you haven't forgotten them. I told Scott what I'll tell every father watching. You don't stop being a dad when your kids grow up. You just learn when to step back and when to step in. Most of the time, you step back. You let them build, let them fail, let them learn. You don't rescue them from consequences or shield them from reality. That's not love. That's crippling them. But when predators circle, when your child faces something that's not a lesson, but an injustice, not a consequence, but a crime, that's when you step in. That's when you use every tool you've got, every lesson you've learned, every bit of preparation you've built over decades. And here's what I learned. The most powerful thing you can do for your children isn't grand gestures. It's small decisions made years in advance, filing a deed correctly, teaching them to document everything, showing them how to build foundations that last. Don't wait for disaster to show you care. Build the protections now, while there's time. Now, to the sons, the men who are someone's child, no matter how old you are. When you're broken, don't disappear into pride. Scott initially refused my help. When I found him that night in his janitor uniform, his first instinct was shame. Shame that his father saw him at his lowest. Shame that he couldn't fix it himself. Shame that he needed saving. But here's the truth. Accepting vulnerability isn't weakness. It's wisdom. Your father, your mother, your family, whoever raised you, they didn't invest all those years just to stand on the sidelines when you're drowning. Let them help. Let them step in. Let them use the tools and wisdom they've spent a lifetime gathering. Pride kills more good men than bullets ever did. Scott let me help, and it saved him. Not just his company. It saved him. Because carrying that weight alone for 3 more years would have destroyed him completely. If you're facing something you can't handle alone, betrayal, loss, injustice, reach out. Call your father. Call someone who's been through the fire and knows how to walk through it. You're not weak for needing help. You're smart for accepting it. And to everyone watching, fathers, sons, daughters, mothers, everyone in between, here's the final truth I've learned in 68 years on this earth. Family isn't about never falling. It's about who shows up when you do. Scott fell. Emily's death knocked him down, and Victor kicked him while he was there. For 3 years, my son was invisible, broken, lost in the margins of his own life. But I showed up, not because I'm a hero. I'm just a retired construction foreman who kept some papers in a safe deposit box. I showed up because that's what family does. And when Scott needed me, the foundation I'd built 15 years earlier was waiting. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Share your story in the comments. Tell me about a time your father, or mother, or someone who loved you, showed up when you were falling. Tell me about a lesson they taught you that saved you later. Tell me about the foundations they built that you're still standing on. And if you're a father watching this, tell me, what are you building for your children? What protections are you planting? What lessons are you teaching? Hit that like button if your father taught you to keep the receipts, to document everything, to trust, but verify. Subscribe if you want more stories about real people facing real problems with dignity and wisdom. And comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me your story. Tell me what this meant to you. Because that's how we build community. That's how we pass down wisdom. That's how we make sure the next generation knows what we learned the hard way. Scott's company is thriving now. That janitor uniform still hangs in his office, reminding him daily that you can lose everything except who you are. And every Sunday, we have dinner together, father and son, talking about the week, planning the future, building something that can't be stolen. That's my legacy, not the buildings I helped construct, but the son I raised and the foundation I protected. What will yours be? Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, protect the foundation, because someday, someone you love might need it to survive. God bless, and I'll see you in the comments.